Good evening and welcome. I'm delighted to see you all here, and I thank you. I'm David Scobie, the Executive Dean of the New School for General Studies, and Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy. And it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce a lecture by Professor Casey Nelson Blake, The Arts as Social Research, part of an annual lecture series looking back to the history and founding of the New School as we look forward to the centennial of the university in 2019. As the Dean of the Founding Division of the university, and myself a historian of New York City, I believe that this occasion, critically engaging our own history of critical engagement, is precisely the right way to celebrate the New School at 91. Indeed, this year's annual lecture comes at a rich moment in the ongoing history of the university. In January, we welcome a new president, David Van Zandt, and meanwhile, my own division has just renewed its own intellectual traditions and mandate, integrating programs in policy, management, international affairs, media studies and creative writing, an undergraduate bachelor's program with interdisciplinary programs in urban, environmental, and global studies, a whole omnibus of programs dedicated to a new kind of divisional educational community where learning and research are organized around interdisciplinary engagement with the largest and most pressing public issues, where liberal learning is integrated with social and political practice, and where we examine and pursue the democratic and civic purposes of higher education. We're building an experimental kind of division here, one based on crossing boundaries between different fields and between the academy and the larger world. In other words, we are looking forward by reaching back to the founding values and legacies of the New School. And tonight's occasion helps us to know the possibilities of that history more deeply. No one I know is better able to help us look both backward and forward at this history, and to look both inward across our university and outward across its social and political aims than Casey Nelson Blake. A professor of history and American studies at Columbia, Casey is among the leading US cultural and intellectual historians of my generation, someone whose work I have read and taught and learned from for 25 years. He's perhaps our leading scholar on the relationship between the arts, public intellectual life, and democratic thought in 20th century America, most of all in 20th century New York, and the author of The Arts of Democracy, Art, Public Culture, and the State, Beloved Community, and many other important works. He's both a citizen scholar and a scholar of the arts of citizenship. And so he is a great guide for our own look backward at the arts, democracy, social inquiry, and higher education at the New School. It's a great joy to introduce my colleague and friend, Casey Blake.
Thank you, David, for that extremely generous and warm introduction. And thank you, Julia, for the invitation to speak here. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's really an honor to speak here tonight and to participate in the series of lectures leading up to the centennial of the New School's founding. I'm especially pleased to speak so soon after David's arrival. I view his work in civic engagement as, in many ways, carrying on the best traditions of the New School. You are all very lucky to have him as your dean. I come as a longtime admirer of this institution and the values it has championed for over 90 years. As a historian, I found myself returning time and again to the cluster of intellectuals who launched the New School and to the vision of public life they hoped it would foster. The New School was founded at a moment when American nationality, the idea of a civic culture, and the modern were all more fluid than they have often seemed in retrospect, more amenable to popular strivings, cosmopolitan mixing, and democratic hope. Now, I am, of course, aware that the new school was founded in some respects as an anti-Columbia. And without going into my views of my home institution, I'll simply say that I've never felt that I've crossed into enemy territory when I've found myself on West 12th Street. Now, when Julia invited me to speak tonight on the arts as social research, I initially thought that I could easily prepare a lecture that would draw on work I've done over the years on the arts and intellectual life in the United States. But in fact, as I dug deeper and deeper into the subject, I realized the enormity of the assignment. The arts as social research opened the door to virtually everything. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was impossible even to scratch the surface of this vast subject without considering the meanings that people here and elsewhere associated with every word in my title: the arts, social, research, and that troubling as. If I were going to take on all of that, I'd better pack some lunch. Now, what follows, I'm afraid, may seem more like a multi-course dinner than a quick lunch, and I certainly don't want to keep you all here until the 2019 centennial of the new school's founding. But because this is a mammoth theme, I think that it might be helpful if I give you all a headline for the argument I want to make tonight. For much of its history, the New School for Social Research was part of a dissenting tradition, a counterculture, if you will, within two of the most important cultural projects of the last century: the Modern Research University and Modern Art. Those projects were critical to the school's founding and subsequent development. There would have been nothing we would recognize as the new school without them. But the new school, at its best, represented a civic orientation towards research, pedagogy, and modern art that cut against the grain of the dominant tendencies in those fields. It was very much a part of what the art critic Harold Rosenberg later called the tradition of the new, but it was also part of a dissenting tradition within that tradition. So what I'd like to do this evening is sketch out the early history of that dissenting tradition, which I believe deserves another look as we consider the situation of the university today. In retrospect, the emergence of the modern research university in Germany and the United States 150 years ago appears an inevitable response to the growing prestige of empirical science and the consolidation of large-scale corporate enterprise. Corporations required scientific expertise, centralized research and development operations, and a cadre of managers to administer enterprises that were increasingly national and even international in scope. Older educational institutions, whether they were classical colleges, institutes of mechanics and inventors, or craft apprenticeships, appeared at best irrelevant or at worst impediments to economic progress. With the new Johns Hopkins and Clark universities taking the lead, the American Research University made the training of professionals its core educational mission. The Research University was committed to the production of new knowledge, giving birth to the social sciences that modeled themselves after the natural sciences and quickly generated new academic departments, new journals, and new professional organizations. In the process, the social sciences distanced themselves from earlier traditions of inquiry, rhetoric and classical philosophy, for example, and from their initial connection to movements for social reform. Scholars in economics, political science, and sociology, for the most part, embraced the ethic of disinterested, value-free research that had seemingly yielded such extraordinary results in the natural sciences. An institution founded as the New School for Social Research was obviously deeply indebted to these innovations in higher education, though I think that from the start it had a unique and ambivalent relationship to the research university model. Moreover, the founders of the New School were themselves divided about what kind of education their institution would provide, and about the connection between social research and public life. The educational ideas of New School founders Thorstein Veblen and John Dewey provide a window, I think, onto two competing conceptions of the institution's original mission. Could I have the next slide, please? Thorstein Veblen is best remembered today for the theory of the leisure class, his brilliant 1899 work of social criticism that deployed sociology, anthropology, and satirical skills worthy of Mark Twain in a devastating account of how a culture of conspicuous consumption perpetuated class hierarchy in the United States. Ruling class men, in his account, maintained their hegemony through the ostentatious display of waste and useless accessories, everything from wives rendered into ornaments by corsets to lawns, college Gothic architecture, and dogs, the filthiest of the domestic animals, Veblen called them, and nastiest in his habits. The leisure class, in Veblen's view, subjugated the instinct of workmanship to pecuniary gain, hobbling the matter-of-fact knowledge essential to industrial progress. Veblen's later book, The Higher Learning in America of 1918, a study in total depravity, as he suggested, extended this critique of conspicuous consumption to encompass academic life. Veblen's target in this book was what he called the submergence of the university in vocational training, undergraduate education, and, in his words, the edification of the unlearned by university extension and similar excursions into the field of public amusement. Veblen called for the emancipation of research, the exercise of idle curiosity from undergraduate education, and the pecuniary interests of trustees and college presidents. The research university, as at its best, he argued, was the heir to a long line of institutions devoted to the pursuit of what he called esoteric knowledge, although now that knowledge was of a matter-of-fact, mechanistic complexion, a deliberately irresponsible science and scholarship that had to be protected from interlopers. Veblen insisted that the affairs of learning be segregated from the affairs of life. In fact, the research university might not suffice for the exercise of idle curiosity. A better solution, in his view, would be research institutes existing in some sort of academic quarantine without any instructional responsibilities whatsoever. David Reisman later characterized Veblen's idle curiosity as the curiosity of the bystander. John Dos Passos famously wrote that Veblen looked at the world from the outside. Now, Veblen had an erratic academic career that seems somehow appropriate for a man who was so utterly contemptuous of instructional responsibilities. A notoriously indifferent teacher, he mumbled through his lectures, seemingly lecturing into his beard, and assigned all his students a C at the end of every term. When one student complained, he changed the entire class's grade to an A. A man whose ideal was a commonwealth of ungraded men apparently believed in ungraded students. Not surprisingly, he didn't last long at any job, bouncing from Chicago to Stanford to Missouri before landing here at the new school. Things didn't work out so well here either. Director Alvin Johnson tried to make it easier for students to hear Veblen by installing a loudspeaker in the classroom. On the first day, 80 students showed up, but once Veblen tossed the microphone into a wastebasket, students drifted away and never returned. Johnson thought he would make me popular, Veblen reportedly told a colleague, but I fooled him. And Johnson sent him packing in 1925. Could I have the next slide, please? The pragmatist philosopher John Dewey was not a regular faculty member at the new school, but he taught courses here occasionally and was in many respects the most influential of the intellectuals who shaped the institution's mission in its early years. Dewey shared Veblen's appreciation of the scientific cast of mind as a solvent of outmoded traditions, but the two men could not have been more different in their views on the proper relationship between expertise and democracy. Veblen sought to quarantine the affairs of learning from the affairs of life. By contrast, Dewey called on universities to meet public needs. Academic culture had no future, he believed, unless it could operate in the conditions of modern life, of daily life, of political and industrial life. Dewey's most important work of political theory, The Public and Its Problems of 1927, made the case for social inquiry as indispensable to the reinvigoration of democratic politics. This was not inquiry understood as Veblen's esoteric knowledge, but what Dewey called embodied intelligence. The prime condition of a democratically organized public, he wrote, is a kind of knowledge and insight which does not yet exist. The new social sciences were indispensable tools for the analysis and reconstruction of social institutions, but academics deluded themselves in thinking that they alone possessed an adequate understanding of modern conditions. It is impossible for highbrows to secure a monopoly of knowledge as must be used for the regulation of common affairs, he wrote. In the degree to which they become a specialized class, they are shut off from knowledge of the needs to which they are supposed to serve. Social inquiry could not exist in isolation. A genuine social science, he insisted, would manifest itself in the daily press and devote itself to the improvement of debate, discussion, and persuasion. An embodied intelligence, to use Dewey's term, an embodied intelligence adequate to contemporary challenges would only emerge through democratic give and take between social researchers and other citizens. One way of imagining what Dewey meant by embodied intelligence is to return to an earlier moment in his biography, to the late 1890s, when as a professor at Chicago, he made his way to Jane Addams's Hull House in search of a new kind of intellectual life. Could I have the next slide, please? Addams and other middle-class women had founded their social settlement in 1888 in one of Chicago's toughest immigrant working-class neighborhoods. The next slide, please. Their Hull House provided social services to their neighbors, but it also served as one of the most vital cultural centers in the city. Hull House residents offered classes, sponsored public lectures and debates, exhibited the arts and crafts of their immigrant neighbors in its labor museum, and joined with local residents in municipal reform efforts. Addams later contrasted the pluralistic culture of the settlement house to the homogeneous environment of the academy. Residents of Hull House, she argued, feel that they should promote a culture which will not set its possessor aside in a class with others like himself, but which will connect him with all sorts of people by his ability to understand them, as well as by his power to supplement their present surroundings. Hull House taught Dewey how intellectual work and civic work might be brought together into a new synthesis that addressed the needs of a city roiled by class and ethnic tensions. It's not surprising, then, that when Dewey outlined his vision of the school as a social center, he took the settlement house as his model for democratic education. What we want to see is to see the school, every public school, doing something of the same sort of work that is now done by a settlement or two. Now, as far as I know, Dewey never wrote explicitly about the new school. I might be wrong, but I've not encountered anything that he's written on this institution. But I think it's reasonable to assume that the new school's commitment to the public dissemination of new ideas in the social sciences, humanities, and the arts fit his conception of knowledge as embodied intelligence. The original new school was a kind of settlement house without a social work component, a Hull House with a more elaborate social science curriculum. To some extent, this is the road not taken in modern academic life, though one finds examples of it here and there. In the University of Wisconsin at Madison, for example, where social scientists joined farmers and organized labor in Robert La Follette's Reform Coalition. In Arthur Morgan's Antioch College, with its Deweyan work-study curriculum. At Berea College, which likewise has a work-study program, and other progressive experiments in higher education. But this is, I think, very much a minoritarian tradition within the contemporary academy. Could I have the next slide, please? Lewis Mumford may stand in some respects as the archetypal New School student and faculty member. Though he never completed a BA anywhere, Mumford was inspired by Veblen's mumbled lectures at the New School to launch his own investigations into technology and culture. Mumford's career as a public intellectual included a stint as an instructor at the New School, where he taught what may have been the first course on American architecture ever taught in this country. His astonishing range of interests, literature, architecture, technology, urban planning, politics, moral philosophy, and much else besides, made him the very embodiment of the New School idea. Mumford also served as the bridge between the school's early focus on social science and its subsequent opening to the study and practice of the arts, modern art in particular. Could I have the next slide, please? Here, in fact, you see a cartoon of the meeting of the American Artists Congress, which was a popular front organization of the 30s, which was held here at the New School with Mumford at the podium and suitably dressed in worker attire. Mumford consistently made the case for social research as the study of symbolic interaction, the human transformation of facts in the raw through the tools and instruments society has developed throughout history. Words, symbols, grammar, logic, in short, the whole technique of communication and funded experience. Social research, in his view, entailed more than the study of aggregate social behavior. It meant an inquiry into the ways in which human beings transform their environment into cultural form and in the process transformed themselves. This was a kind of cultural turn in social research long before the cultural turn of the last quarter century. Mumford helped the New School make that cultural turn in another way. He was largely responsible for the selection of Joseph Urban as the architect for the 12th Street building and of his friends Jose Clemente Orozco and Thomas Hart Benton to paint murals on its walls. And we are, in other words, in this room today because of Mumford's efforts. From Adams to Dewey to Mumford, from Hull House to the New School, one finds a conception of social research as engaged intellectual practice that constitutes a counter-tradition embedded within the research model of higher education. The contrast that I've drawn between Veblenian and Deweyan approaches to social research may be useful in considering the conflicting tendencies within the modernist movement in the arts that was likewise so important to the New School's development. We are not accustomed to thinking that the modernist avant-garde, particularly in its early heroic phase, had much to do with the research university. The bohemian, iconoclastic, and anti-institutional tendencies in modernism seem profoundly at odds with academic proprieties and the disciplinary structure of the university. Artists and writers working in modern idioms rarely found employment there in the early 20th century. Humanities programs in American higher education remained bastions of the genteel tradition well into the 30s. They promoted an Arnoldian cult of the best, as critic Randolph Bourne put it, at the expense of innovation. Indeed, outside of the New School, Black Mountain College, and Bennington, it was almost impossible to take courses on literary and artistic modernism in this country until well into the post-war period. Having said that, I think there are important parallels between the impulses that led to the creation of the research university and the consolidation of the dominant current in modernist art. Veblen's quarantined university, devoted to esoteric knowledge, found an echo in the avant-garde idea of an aesthetic defined in opposition to popular taste. The very notion of an artistic vanguard resembled the professionalizing aspirations of many social scientists, as both groups established their own institutions and standards of evaluation. And both the research university and the avant-garde defined themselves in terms of innovation rather than the transmission of cultural traditions. The effort by some artists and critics to quarantine art from common experience was already in evidence during the period of the New School's founding. Could I have the next slide, please? The 1913 International Exhibition of Modern Art, the famous Armory Show, is a case in point. The Armory Show is remembered today as an icon of pre-World War I cultural modernism, often invoked as an artistic partner to the radical politics that energized the Greenwich Village intelligentsia in the same period. Here was a moment, it seemed, when radicalism in the arts and politics advanced together, when Alfred Stieglitz and Big Bill Haywood met at Mabel Dodge's salon, and their followers marched arm in arm from Union Square to the Armory at 25th Street. Art historian Joanne Mancini has offered a bracing corrective to this view of the Armory Show, one that I think has important implications for how we consider the cultural context for the New School's founding. The Armory Show's champions were engaged, in her words, in a much less democratic struggle to limit and police access to artistic knowledge and the art world itself, by separating artistic expertise from common practices of artistic evaluation. Rather than joining modernism to radical political change, the show's champions redefined art as a wholly separate realm of human experience and made artistic judgment the exclusive domain of experts. Such ideas appear again and again in the articles that artists and critics wrote in defense of the show. The advantage of modern art, one enthusiast wrote, was that it removes life to another court by referring it not to any past experiences of life, but exactly to a sense of a recognition of new life, new art. Another enthusiast urged artists to have the courage to be different from our fellow sheep. This line of argument carried with it an emphasis on the finished art object as the principal subject of art criticism, to the exclusion of any consideration of artistic process, social context, or reception. The modern research university had defined disciplinary knowledge in terms of a bounded field of inquiry subject to the evaluation of professionals. Defenders of the Armory Show made art objects the vehicles for an aesthetic ideology that likewise distinguished the esoteric knowledge of art experts from the folk wisdom of their fellow sheep. The professionalizing tendency in American modernism shared with the research university another obsession, the idea of science understood as technique as the driving force behind cultural progress. More often than not, modernists relied on a crude scientism to narrow the boundaries of modern art. The New School was not immune to such tendencies, as the tragic career of music critic Paul Rosenfeld demonstrates. Can I have the next slide, please? Rosenfeld had emerged in the 19-teens as the most important commentator on modern music in the United States. He was a regular contributor to the Seven Arts magazine. You see his important essay, The American Composer, listed in the table of contents here. And he was a mainstay of the Alfred Stieglitz circle of artists and photographers at 291 Fifth Avenue. In his writings and in the musical salon he organized in his apartment, Rosenfeld introduced Americans to new currents in musical culture, promoted the work of young modernists, and welcomed émigré composers to this country. It's a sign of Rosenfeld's prominence as a critic that Alvin Johnson recruited him in 1927 to teach a course on modern composers and to build the new school's music program. That Rosenfeld is barely remembered today speaks volumes about the transformation of American modernism in the first decades of the last century. Part of the problem was his literary style, which Columbia graduate student Jude Weber describes as often vague, opaque, diaphanous, and impressionistic, more empathetic than analytic. And I should say here that I'm indebted to Jude Weber's work for much of what I'm going to say about Rosenfeld's career. But impressionistic prose was only part of Rosenfeld's problem. Rosenfeld's emphasis on the communal setting for musical innovation and his broader aspirations for American modernism quickly became an embarrassment to other proponents of the new music. For Rosenfeld understood modern composition as part of a much larger cultural project in which cosmopolitan communities of artists, musicians, and public intellectuals prefigured a more inclusive cosmopolitan conception of the United States itself, what Randolph Bourne called a transnational America. The intellectual ground for modern music shifted under Rosenfeld's feet almost as soon as he arrived at the new school. Within a few years of his appointment, Rosenfeld came under fierce attack from his new colleague, the composer Henry Cowell. Could I have the next slide, please? Cowell dismissed critics like Rosenfeld, who in his words, are not themselves composers. They do not understand in the least what is taking place in either feeling or technique, but give out vague personal impressions which have little relation to reality. In the place of impressionistic criticism, Cowell recommended what he called a theory of musical relativity and asserted that the finest tastes and the perfect use of scientifically coordinated materials go together. Such an approach had no use for Rosenfeld's understanding of art making as a communal endeavor, or his hope that modern artists would enable a more capacious understanding of American national identity. Cowell's technical formalism quickly dominated the new school's music program. Music students who wanted more than technique enrolled in courses in the emerging discipline of musicology, not the kinds of classes in literature, music, and the visual arts that Rosenfeld regularly offered here. When Cowell organized a major 1933 conference at the school on contemporary American music, Roosevelt's name was notably absent from the program. He had, in effect, been banished from the landscape of musical modernity. By the time Rosenfeld died of a heart attack in 1946, at the age of 56, he was largely unknown in musical circles. The new school became the site for several battles over the meaning of the modern, and in one case, quite literally the site. Could I have the next slide, please? The debate over Joseph Urban's 1931 new school building is a revealing episode in the inner civil war within modernism. Alvin Johnson's selection of the Viennese emigre at Mumford's suggestion reflected the prevalent view in new school circles that a new kind of school required a new kind of architecture. Urban responded enthusiastically with a plan meant, in his words, to house an idea, the new school idea of education as a resource for a public culture. Urban had a distinguished career before coming to the US and in his early years here as a set designer. And he made the school's oval-shaped auditorium, could I have the next slide, please, the central element of his design program. Urban's auditorium was meant literally as a stage for dramatic interventions by public intellectuals. Thrust into close contact with the audience, speakers would find themselves surrounded by the public in a dramatic enactment of a new kind of learning. Urban was a functionalist, but his idea of function was thoroughly social and humanistic, closer to Mumford than to Mies van der Rohe. The function to be served here was the new school idea of education performed in the service of a robust democratic life. The young Philip Johnson, then just launching himself as an architectural tastemaker, had no interest in a humanistic functionalism, let alone the drama of a democratic public life. In an early article, Johnson denounced Urban's new school as, in his words, an illusion of a building in the international style rather than a building resulting from a genuine understanding of the new principles. The function of a modern building, in Johnson's view, was defined by its structural requirements. Ornamentation was to be avoided at all costs. Urban failed the test. The facade, Johnson wrote, is not devoid of ornament, and the egg-shaped design of the auditorium was equally arbitrary. The architect has imposed on an auditorium a preconceived form in much the same way as Beaux-Arts designers have done for 100 years. Johnson's critique of Urban's design anticipated the arguments that he and Henry Russell Hitchcock would roll out in their hugely influential international style exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art a year later. Could I have the next slide, please? The initial idea of the modern movement as a project that brought architects, planners, and progressive reformers together in response to pressing public need gave way at the MoMA show to a formalist high style suitable for corporate office buildings. In later years, Johnson would openly mock people like Mumford and Urban, who had taken what he called a romantically moral attitude toward design. Architectural design somehow had to be based on honesty, social improvement, sound structure, functional consideration of the problems of our day, et cetera, et cetera. And the sneering sound that you hear in Johnson's use of the words et cetera, was intentional. Painters were luckier, he wrote. Architecture, the most social of the arts, was at its best in Johnson's view when it resembled abstract painting. Here was a formalist architectural modernism that Clement Greenberg could approve of. Silent contemplation of easel paintings was the model for an aesthetics defined in strictly formal or technical terms. By contrast, Urban's New School Auditorium, a stage set for public argument, made the collaborative performance of lecturers and audience the dominant metaphor for the new school's public mission. In fact, the idea of group performance was itself a driving force behind the emergence of an alternative modernist aesthetic that emphasized what John Dewey called the continuity of aesthetic experience with normal processes of living. The origin of expressive culture, Dewey argued in his magisterial Art as Experience of 1934, lay in the performance of ritual. Art is the extension of the power of rites and ceremonies to unite men, he wrote, through a shared celebration to all incidents and scenes of life. The connections that Dewey and Urban traced between ritual, performance, and public culture had a precedent in the Patterson strike pageant. Could I have the next slide, please? Which was held in 1913, the very same year as the Armory Show, and was intended as a benefit for striking textile workers in Paterson, New Jersey. John Reed, Mabel Dodge, and other mainstays of the Greenwich Village scene organized a pageant in which hundreds of workers from Paterson joined artists in reenacting episodes from the strike against the backdrop of a 90-foot mural painted, a mural of the city's silk factories painted by John Sloan. The performance ended, appropriately enough, with workers, actors, artists, and audience members joining together in a singing of the Internationale. The pageant actually lost money in the end, and the strikes were defeated months later. But the event impressed many at the time as an example of a new collective art form, a fusing social art, in Randolph Bourne's words, that dissolved traditional boundaries between artists and their audience and between the represented and the real. The Patterson Strike pageant pioneered a fusing social art that would powerfully shape subsequent experiments. To make the move from individual contemplation of an isolated art object to a performative model of culture carried with it a profound rethinking of the aesthetic. Aesthetic experience understood as performance was a dynamic, collaborative effort made meaningful by the active engagement of audiences who were, in their own way, culture makers. Dewey's art as experience located the site of what he called consummatory aesthetic experience in the imaginative horizon where the creator met the beholder. The beholder was a creator in her own right, according to Dewey, interpreting artworks through an act of recreation that transcended passive perception. This shift in aesthetic understanding underwrote a wide range of artistic projects in the interwar period. One can find its influence in several related initiatives that together or in part drove work both here at the New School and beyond. The group idea of collaborative art making, the coordination of different media into a unified artistic whole, efforts to make the process of creating art manifest in finished art objects, the blurring of the boundaries of art and public life so as to include other citizens as creators, and the representation of history as a pageant or procession culminating in the social struggles of the present. The collaborative group idea of artistic creation was so central to the alternative modernist project and so prevalent in the middle of the last century that it's hard to know where to begin with representative examples. Here at the New School, the artistic workshop was understood as a kind of laboratory for a new pedagogy that stressed collective approaches to art making across the lines of genre and medium. We're so accustomed to the use of workshop as a term for classes on virtually everything, from writing to yoga and cooking, that we tend to forget its novelty in these years and the aspirations that the term was meant to connote. The idea of the workshop made the process of art making as important as the finished product. The reworking of experience into symbolic form was the artwork that artists created. The product of artistic activity is significantly called the work of art, Dewey told his readers. Modernists working in this tradition believed that the creative process at its best was a collaborative and often improvisational enterprise. Workshops were intended to bring together people working in different media and in different fields at the very start of the creative process and keep them in dialogue with one another as projects move forward. Norman Pearson launched the New School's design workshop as an integrated program in the visual arts in the 1930s, and Erwin Piscator brought his experience in German left-wing theater to bear on the creation of the dramatic workshop here in the 1940s. In contrast to the narrow training Cowell promoted in music, Piscator required students in the dramatic workshop to take classes in politics, sociology, philosophy, history, and other fields as they moved towards what he called a total theater. A Deweyan conception of art as artwork dovetailed with other efforts by artists in the 30s to redefine themselves as culture workers, allied with industrial unionists. That alliance, in turn, inspired artistic experiments that built on the humanistic functionalism of an Urban or a Mumford. One such effort, could I have the next slide, please, was the Design Laboratory in New York, which began in 1935 under the auspices of the New Deal's Federal Arts Project, then reorganized in 1937 under the sponsorship of the CIO, and then had a brief existence as an independent laboratory school of industrial design until financial problems forced the school's closing in 1940. And my comments on the Design Lab draw on a forthcoming article by historian Shannon Clark, who places this episode in the larger context of organizing by culture workers during the 30s and 40s. The lab's founders insisted that industrial design was an integral element of modern production, not something added after the fact to market commodities. A lab teacher told students to give up the idea of the designer as romantic genius and accept that their work was just one part of the manufacturing process. They were, in his words, in no more exalted a position than the tool and die maker in the factory. This redefinition of art as collaborative work and of the designer as culture worker allied with industrial laborers demanded in turn a new kind of art education. A 4-term course on cultural morphology taught by Elizabeth McCausland had students reading Veblen, Mumford, the Beards, and the Linns, a new canon that Shannon Clark calls progressive cultural materialism. Meanwhile, students were instructed to make tools and other products so simple in their design that users could read the labor process that produced them. The Design Lab, the Design Lab was too short-lived for this aesthetic project to reach maturity. Competition from Art Deco designers and modernist advocates of the international style quickly crowded out a left functionalist alternative, while the conservative assault on the FAP and CIO destroyed the lab's patronage base. Indeed, the lab's brief and troubled history is a reminder of the fragility of the civic modernist project I'm sketching out here, and of the difficulty one faces in trying to distinguish it from more familiar formalist currents within modernism. That said, I still think it's possible to trace a line of experiments that includes the Design Lab and which together constitute a dissenting civic tradition within modernism. One such effort, if I could have the next slide, please, was the group theater that Harold Clurman and Lee Strasberg launched in the 30s. And here you see some of the key players in the group theater. Clurman wrote in his remarkable memoir, The Fervent Years, that he intended the group theater as a way of overcoming the loneliness of the individual actor and of encouraging collaboration between actors, directors, and writers from the very start of productions. Clurman contested the romantic individualism of people working in his field. Actors, he said, were citizens of a community before they took on their dubious connection with art. Their collaboration in the group theater impelled an experiment in living that prefigured a more solidaristic American culture as a whole. Clurman's 1931 manifesto, What the Group Theater Wants, spoke directly to this issue. In the end, he wrote, the development of playwrights, actors, repertory, and the rest are important only as they lead to the creation of a tradition of common values, an active consciousness of a common way of looking at and dealing with life. A theater in our country today should aim to create an audience. When an audience feels that it is really at one with the theater, when audience and theater people can feel that they are both the answer to one another, and that both may act as leaders to one another, there we have the theater in its truest form. This redefinition of the art process as a means to a new way of living reached its climax in the New Deal's Federal Art Project of 1935 to 1943, and in particular, the community arts centers the FAP sponsored to broaden the scope of popular participation in the arts. Dewey's dictum from art as experience became the FAP's mantra. As long as art is the beauty parlor of civilization, neither art nor civilization is secure. FAP director and Dewey protege Holger Cahill looked to the Progressive School and Settlement House as models for the Community Arts Center, which he called a community in action. Could I have the next slide, please? The road to appreciation is to do, not only to watch, he maintained. Wherever art becomes more than a spectator activity, the quality of life is immeasurably improved. The end of art making, in this view, was the remaking of individuals as active, creative citizens. In these and other efforts from this period, one finds echoes of the performative approach to modernism as a fusing social art dating back to the years surrounding the New School's founding. Nowhere was that approach more powerfully expressed in the murals movement of the 1930s. Muralists and their supporters saw in murals a public art that represented history as a dramatic narrative linking the past and the present and indeed the future. Could I have the next slide, please? Artist Thomas Hart Benton wrote of his early career, "History was not a scholarly study for me, but a drama. I saw it not as a succession of events, but a continuous flow of action having its climax in my own immediate experience." Holger Cahill spoke repeatedly of an incipient American Renaissance and recommended murals as a heritage to the future created in our own time. Muralist Mitchell Saporin wrote, "There is the big parade for us now of the past melting into the present." Thomas Hart Benton marched at the head of that big parade for most of the 30s, with Jose Clemente Orozco not far behind. It was a stroke of genius on the part of Johnson and Mumford to invite them to paint murals for the New School, and a mark of Joseph Urban's commitment to the institution's public mission that he gave those murals pride of place in his building. Johnson invited each artist to paint a contemporary subject of such importance that no history written 100 years from now could fail to devote a chapter to it. Could I have the next slide, please? Benton's America Today murals were sadly sold by the New School in the 1970s or 80s. The America Today murals, of which you see a panel, did not make use of the narrative historical structure that came to be the defining motif of his later work, particularly his remarkable Indiana and Missouri historical cycles. But there is an implicit history embedded in his representations of contemporary work and culture in the New School murals. As Erica Doss has explained, Benton sought to make the 19th century populism he had inherited from his father and grandfather available to Americans living in an urban industrial society. His murals celebrated producer virtues through an accessible aesthetic he derived from Cubism, Surrealism, and the representational strategies of commercial amusements. Benton's producerism is most evident in the city building panel that you see before you, in which brawny male workers and an engineer registered the persistent exercise of male prowess in an industrial workplace. Contrast this mural, could I have the next slide, please, with Diego Rivera's mural of the Ford auto plant, now at the Detroit Art Institute. Here you're just seeing one piece of that remarkable mural sequence. In Rivera's mural, it is the pulsating rhythm of the assembly line that predominates. And those of you who've seen this sequence of murals knows that there's a kind of lateral horizontal composition created by the assembly line, by machinery, by fan belts that sort of holds the whole composition together. Can I have the next slide, please? Benton's mural has its own visual dynamic, but it's one that leads back diagonally from oversized workers to machines and ultimately the products that men have created with their minds and their muscle. So this is city building, building as an active process, as a work process involving human labor, that, and a composition that leads us back ultimately to the city in the distance. It's a panel that reminds us that the city was built by human beings and continues to be built by human beings. Likewise, Benton's panels representing modern leisure, can I have the next slide, please? Place human activity front and center, and here you just see one of these panels, city activities. Benton had spent 5 years working in the early movie industry and regarded the movie art as a sort of communal art, in his words. And you can see here how Benton relied heavily on the conventions of silent film with its exaggerated gestures, pantomime, and melodramatic characters to tell a story. This was, in its own way, a performative aesthetic, one that took its cues particularly from D.W. Griffith, juxtaposing close-ups with choreographed crowd scenes. Benton's larger-than-life characters literally performed America today for a public that was familiar with such visual conventions from spending time in a movie theater. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, Orozco's New School frescoes, which we wonderfully have around us this evening, lack the energy and sense of play that give Benton's murals their power. The critical consensus is that they are the weakest of the murals he painted in the US, lacking the power and tragic sensibility of the works he made for Pomona College and Dartmouth College. The one exception would be the scenes of repression under slavery and imperialism in the struggle in the Orient panel on your left. And so here we have images of slavery and the brutality of imperial rule before getting an image of national liberation embodied in the figure of Gandhi. Otherwise, the New School ensemble seems strangely at odds with Orozco's maxim. My one theme is humanity. My one tendency is emotion to a maximum. Even the panel depicting the Soviet Revolution and its aftermath, the panel that drew the most criticism at the time and that led New School administrators to cover the work with a curtain during the McCarthy period, lacks vitality. Could I have the next slide, please? One critic characterized the gathering at the table of human brotherhood, which is represented here, it's covered by the screen, as 11 unhappy beings looking as if they were sorry that any such notion as universal brotherhood had ever been hatched. Art historian Diane Miliotes has responded to these criticisms with a courageous and important defense of the New School murals. In her view, Orozco sought to create an activated space in the dining area where they were located, and this room was initially a lounge and dining area. He understood the murals would literally surround diners, frustrating a familiar frontal reading. Orozco, in her words, dispensed with a sequentially readable narrative and sought to elaborate a more complex and thematic relationship among individual panels. His bold color scheme, orange against gray, would intensify viewers' sense of occupying a radically activated space. The result was a mode of representation that I think demands a lot from us as viewers, forcing us to engage in what Dewey called an act of recreation in our reading of the murals. How do we put together the struggle in the Occident and the struggle in the Orient? How do we put together a utopian image of public life and the utopian image behind you, which represents a domestic scene of the homecoming of the worker of the new day? Viewers of this installation are forced to be meaning makers. They are forced to piece together a coherent narrative from the different images of struggle and harmony that press in on them from all sides. As Holger Cahill said, the road to appreciation is to do, not only to watch. This table of universal brotherhood will not be complete until viewers join the rest of the party as active participants. Seated at tables themselves, New School diners and now seminar participants confront a tableau in which the table is dramatically tilted forward in their direction. This invitation to the table, as Miliotes calls it, presumes the necessity to come to grips with the chaos, multiple perspectives, and dissonances of the contemporary world. Could I have the next slide, please? Orozco's murals offer us an example of art as social research, in which art renders social complexity into a complexity of form that resists conventional viewing. They transform an interior academic space into a pragmatist space of multiple meanings and multiple perspectives. There is no single Archimedean point to occupy here, no one sight line that provides a window onto what, in the end, is a pluralistic universe. Understanding that universe begins with an acknowledgement of complexity as the necessary first step toward the cultivation of engaged, embodied intelligence. It is up to us, artists, researchers, and workers, to interpret a public world that is also always a symbolic world of form and forge tools for its reconstruction. Now that I've returned us to Orozco's room, where we sit almost 80 years after the completion of these murals, we may well ask ourselves how to act on this vision of the arts as social research in the very different landscape of the early 21st century. There are no easy answers, needless to say, and I'm not going to offer you easy answers. We see exciting possibilities in the public work that's going on everywhere around us, in community-based theater, art, and public history projects, in the revival of socially conscious architecture after 2 decades of celebrity starchitecture, in innovative art, writing, and teaching online, and much, much more. In a tentative, halting, often inchoate way, such projects reclaim the cultural commons as a space separate from the market and the state, and revive the idea of citizens as culture makers. As I consider the alternative traditions I've sketched out here, the public pedagogy of a Dewey, the civic modernism of a Mumford, I'm left with the sense that the time has come to reconsider the very idea of research as the organizing principle of higher education. The research university is in deep trouble today for reasons I don't need to rehearse here. Liberal learning is under assault from seemingly every quarter, from right-wing pseudo-populists, from market fundamentalists, and from neoliberal advocates of standardized testing. The response of many academics has been to circle the wagons in defense of an institution that, to my mind, has long been in need of reconstruction, to use a good old-fashioned New School term. The specialization of disciplinary knowledge over the course of the last century has yielded extraordinary results, but it seems more remote than ever from the world beyond campus walls, and remote even from the concerns of many faculty. There is a hunger among young people for an education that joins academic learning to experiential learning. Many are also trying to make the internet something more than a marketing tool. And they do so in a radically changed cultural landscape, the nature of which we're only beginning to map out, let alone understand. Collaborations between faculty, students, and practitioners outside the university often invoke Dewey's memory, and they should. That kind of collaborative work is, to my mind, better understood as practice than as research. I don't mean by this that intellectual and artistic work should be rendered practical in the sense of being narrowly utilitarian. Rather, I'm thinking of what William Sullivan has called practical reasoning. The back and forth between general knowledge and the challenges and responsibilities that come with particular situations, in his words. An ongoing process of reflection whose end is the formation of habits of critical judgment for action. Sullivan recommends an approach to education that recognizes that in practical reasoning, it is always the involved stance that provides the ground and the goal for critical analytical reasoning. Note Sullivan's use of reasoning, a process, rather than reason as a product. Note too the term involved stance, a phrase that recalls Dewey's idea of an embodied intelligence. At its best, the New School has taken an involved stance in its approach to the arts as social research and public practice. That is an approach still worth defending, I think, almost a century after its founding. Thanks very much.
Casey, I'm sure you're willing to take questions and talks and responses.
Yes, and I also realize that some people may have to leave. I won't take that as a referendum on the talk. But yes, I'm happy to answer any questions or to hear comments and suggestions you might have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it makes one proud to be associated with the institution, just to hear how much you've ennobled all of its past. What would you say are the, 3 or 4 institutions you can think of that most embody at the current time the types of things that you would say best represent what you've been describing?
What a great question, and what a tough question. I don't know. I realize this is being taped, so I don't know if your question was picked up. So I was asked, to name a couple of other institutions that seem to adhere to and are trying to advance this tradition. We will see what happens to Antioch, for example, which is rebuilding itself from the ashes, as it were. In some respects, I think you see elements of this in the cluster of liberal arts colleges that have committed themselves seriously to civic engagement and to a synthesis of public work and classroom work. One sees this at Bates, one sees this at Ursinus, one sees this at Berea. There are a number of other such colleges. Wagner College in Staten Island is an extraordinary example of this. I don't know enough about each of the institutions that I've mentioned to say this with confidence, let alone certainty. But it would surprise me if in every one of the cases I mentioned, one finds the same dual commitment to the arts and social research that one sees at the New School. That's there in some of these institutions, but not in all of them. Yes?
I just had a question about how you frame the understanding of exactly what arts you are going to do within your presentation. Within the class that I'm doing with Milano, we're studying arts management and cultural policy, and one of our major questions we deal with is what is art? And especially within the context of today, especially in Milano, dealing with nonprofit management, we look at food culture a lot as well, and how that is kind of being integrated within. Is that a separate sector, or does that exactly go within the arts because it involves creativity, innovation? And in some of what you talked about, especially with early professors here who like the integration of public practice as well. That also seems to me could fit in that category. Do you think that might also emerge in the category, or do histories could possibly involve that within the study of, food culture and social research integrated together?
Yeah, great question. Well, in terms of the selection criteria that I used, I have to say that this long lecture initially was 2 or 3 times as long. It was everything but the kitchen sink and the kitchen sink too. So a good deal had to be thrown overboard. But I think your reference to food culture is a very interesting one, because I'm often asked, well, where does one see the contemporary legacy of the approach to urbanism articulated by a Mumford or a Percival Goodman or Louis Kahn or other such figures in the 20th century? Where does one see the legacy of that kind of thinking today? And it seems to me one sees it in 2 places, at least. One is in the urban community gardens movement, which often has an aesthetic dimension to it, and certainly has a community building dimension to it, and involves a reclamation of urban space for different kinds of purposes. That, in addition to all its other benefits. And the other contemporary project that seems to me to carry on this civic modernist tradition in urbanism is the co-housing movement, which is not solely an urban phenomenon, but in many cases is based in cities. So yes, this is a long-winded way of saying I think that one could very interestingly look at food culture as a way in which social and ecological research are joined to urbanist design practices. David, yeah.
First of all, thank you, Casey. That was wonderful. And it frames kind of our own efforts to, for lack of a better phrase, build kind of a new school for social practice today in a wonderful way. When people talk about the new conditions for higher education, 2 of the first phrases they say are the globalizing of higher education and digital technologies, both of which are transforming the way we teach and make knowledge, make meaning together. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how this tradition that whose history you're giving us as a potential, something to be reclaimed, might kind of live in the contexts of global and digital education.
Those are big and necessary questions, the kinds of questions that a dean should be addressing. On globalization, I speak as someone whose family history is a global one, which is probably true of everyone in this room. And as someone committed to the kind of cosmopolitan intellectual project that the New School was so committed to, and remains committed to, I sometimes fear that globalization talk, which comes so easily to many people, gets in the way of our thinking creatively about where we are actually located. Now, an institution that is located in New York is situated in a city that has always been an international city. And so I think, for me, the challenge is to figure out how making local connections, if one is operating in this context, how making local connections resonates with a sort of larger global project. I'd rather know what's going on in the Bronx in this context than what's going on at Abu Dhabi or wherever it is the latest NYU campus is located. It's not to say that what's going on there is uninteresting, but it seems to me if you're going to take social and cultural practice as your mission and want to think seriously about experiential learning that opens up to a larger world, you have to start where you are. Now, as for digital technology, here there's so much going on that I don't think anyone can get their hands around it. I'm struck by the number of young people, they're not exclusively young people, who are trying to make their way as writers, critics, intellectuals, artists, musicians, and so on, using the internet at a time when the older economic structures that supported that way of life or those ways of life seem to be crumbling. Can a digital culture support these endeavors economically without turning the internet over entirely to the market is a tremendous challenge that I think we have to come to terms with. But honestly, this is a subject I suspect that you and others here have thought more about and thought better about than I have. Someone else had their hand up? Yes.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you. We have a classroom here, a good class group, and we really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you.
It's really exciting. Some of the issues that we think about are, arts, culture, social justice, things about, the arts management and the cultural policy piece. But I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on, since you are working a lot with young people, and I guess it's Generation Y, some of us are in different generations in this room, but I wanted to see kind of what your feelings and thoughts were about kind of the contrast, the cultural contrast between the isolation of some of the technology and the way that that's isolated groups, but then the desire to connect, which the internet is kind of bringing out, and sort of the way that arts and culture in cities, especially here, that the interaction with people actually in the space, the development of different cultural areas that have sprung up in different segments and sections of the city. Kind of talk about what your thoughts are about like the isolation and then the desire for even more interaction, both on the internet and in person.
Yeah. Here I suspect that you and perhaps especially your students know far more than I do. I think you've hit upon some really important and fascinating issues. My initial fear, in the early stages of techno-euphoria surrounding the internet was that this would be one more way in which Americans seem to isolate themselves from one another. We would now be drawn into this new screen instead of contending with the world right around us. But it seems to me that there are people who are trying to figure out how to connect this new kind of communications technology with the creation of real communities, whether these are salons or get-togethers or political coalitions, et cetera. Moreover, I find it interesting the way in which some people make use of this technology to revive older forms of communication, like community radio, for example. But, again, I feel like I have only the most superficial knowledge of these developments.
Well, and I would actually tie that back to our last exchange about digital teaching, that it's not only the economics of the internet that pose interesting challenges, but opportunities for new kinds of pedagogical communities, new kinds of publics, for art making, all the issues that of collective creativity that you were talking about. Yeah. There are sort of possibilities for that kind of community building through new media.
Certainly. Yes.
I oftentimes see arts organizations who are engaged, or artists or art troops, theater troops, that are engaged in community engagement practices, making new work in dialogue with non-artists, communities of non-artists, that are framing this as a sort of contemporary innovation in response to the formalist modernist legacy. And I'm actually honestly not sure to what extent they're in dialogue with the legacy you've just described, or if they're actually viewing it as an innovation in response to the formalist modernist legacy. Is this something that you see with frequency?
I think that one sees greater or a greater sense of continuity in certain realms than in others, and in certain parts of the U.S. than others. So that, for example, the Hispanic tradition of muralism in California very self-consciously takes its inspiration from Orozco and the other great Mexican muralists of the 30s, and for good reason. But often the argument for a community arts movement, to use that language, is framed in terms of an opposition to a sort of high modernist, formalist public art project, a project of plop art, as it were, that plopped high art objects into public spaces without much concern for local context or the needs or desires of local communities. And that way of framing the issue is certainly understandable and perhaps welcome. I sometimes wonder if something is lost in framing the issue that way. Because it seems to me that at its best, this sort of liberal modernist project in public art from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s aspired to making public and civic spaces in American downtowns, spaces where Americans of very different backgrounds could recognize one another as students, as citizens rather, maybe as students, but as citizens. And the community arts movement makes a very different move, right? Towards particularism, towards localism. It contests the idea of a sort of common civic project. And we understand all the problems with the liberal modernist movement in public art in the post-war period. But I think there's something to that original civic aspiration that shouldn't be lost and that we lose to our peril. There's another issue here that I didn't mention that doesn't pertain solely to the community arts movement, but it's an issue that, in fact, artists working in that tradition have raised with me. And that has to do with how one what criteria one uses in evaluating artistic production once one makes the kinds of moves that a Dewey recommends, for example, or that the community arts movement participants have made. If art making as opposed to the finished art project is the sort of central issue, if the transformation of art makers is the end product of the art process, then how do we evaluate whether these projects are good projects, successful projects, or unsuccessful projects? How do we evaluate the art products that they inevitably create? Or is evaluation of those products on some level irrelevant? Maybe there's a different set of criteria we should be using. And I've heard artists working in this field ask these questions themselves and ask these questions of me. And I think that it's quite a challenge to know how to respond. And I think this is a challenge, by the way, that art administrators who are trying to make sense of different proposals and different projects on the ground find themselves wrestling with every day. What is a successful project once you make that move?
Casey, I'm mindful that you taught us for an hour and a half, and then you deserve some dinner. You've done two really important things for us, as I see it. One is to situate the history of the New School in a larger history of what you're calling dissenting modernism, and to kind of show the larger world this place helped to change and contest, and the other is to give a history to our own impulses toward this work, and both of those are quite important.